All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend Katie Klabusich. Katie is a writer, a reproductive justice activist, and a media contributor, all of which and more you can find at her site, which is katiespeak.com. You can also follow her on Twitter at Katie_speak. Katie, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Matt, thanks for having me back.
All right, so Katie, this last week, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments on the case McCullen versus Coakley. This is a pretty important case. Tell us, what exactly is this case about?
So the Massachusetts law that is being discussed or was discussed in front of the Supreme Court is about a buffer zone that was created after some very heightened violence around abortion clinics in Massachusetts. Somebody was killed. I mean, this is not just one of those, hey, we don't like the signs. If y'all could stand over to the side, that'd be nice. The 2007 buffer zone law imposes a 35-foot barrier around clinics, and it's being challenged on First Amendment grounds by Eleanor McCullen, who's a 77-year-old self-described plump grandmother who stations herself outside of one of the Boston Planned Parenthoods. She calls herself a sidewalk counselor, which is what the picketers typically call themselves. They say that they're there to help women, all the things that you've covered on the show before that we're used to hearing, the language from the anti-choice movement. So they brought the case in front of the Supreme Court, and when the decision comes down in June, it could have national implications because not every municipality or state or city has buffer zones or bubble laws, but depending on how narrowly this is decided, it could open the door to bubbles and buffers being, challenged across the country.
So I know it's really almost next to impossible to try to predict what the Supreme Court is going to do. Do we have any inclination of how the oral arguments went and how? I mean, again, you never really know with the way justices ask these questions, but do we have any idea, what the actual thought process is? Is there any inclination yet?
Well, predictably, there are opponents. I mean, we can all guess, the four, predictably supreme conservative justices are going to fall down on the side of Coakley, I'm sure. Scalia has said some extremely ignorant things during the discussions and after, things like...
What? Hold on, you're saying Scalia said ignorant things?
I know, right?
I've never heard him do anything like that before.
I know, right? After he unilaterally lifted the stay in Texas, the HB2 stay, the one that closed a third of the clinics in Texas, I'm sure everyone will be shocked that he's not in favor of buffers and bubbles. It was what he said that was so ridiculous. Things like, well, she seems like a nice lady. And if all you did was read the New York Times piece that depicts, the picketers as these sort of pleasant pamphlet-wielding, grandmothers off to the side, I'm sure that's what you'd think. I mean, he's clearly never been near a women's clinic that's barraged. He's clearly never bothered to go anywhere. And as a reminder, his job has a buffer zone. There's a buffer zone around the Supreme Court. So people who are optimistic, at least that it will be narrowly decided or will fall down on the side of reproductive justice advocates, is if they strike it down too widely, I mean, the buffer zones around places like polling locations and the Supreme Court itself could be in jeopardy. So it's going to hinge on whether or not our Chief Justice surprises us. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't say anything. And where Kennedy falls. Kennedy has been really wishy-washy on abortion rights cases, so he could go either way.
Yeah, I mean, and again, the really interesting thing is, like you were saying, the Supreme Court actually has a buffer zone around it. Polling places have buffer zones. This is not something that just strictly falls on these women's health clinics around the country. This is actually something that there are actually several areas in our nation that have these buffer zones. And honestly, this is the one where, in my opinion, is the one where people's lives are at stake and people's health is at stake. This is actually more important than a buffer zone around the Supreme Court.
Right. And arguably, we should be able to, it's more important that we as citizens are able to exercise our First Amendment rights to free speech and protest around a place like the Supreme Court or around a polling place. Not that people should be accosted on their way in to vote, but those are at least those are at least legitimately political actions, right? Politics and law and those sorts of things that we have a right to oppose and be vocal about are happening at the Supreme Court, at polling locations. What's happening at a doctor's office is no one else's business. That's just not, I mean, your right to access your doctor shouldn't be something that other people have a say in.
Yeah, and again, it's like even, and again, I don't think anyone really thinks that the fact that just if you look at the polling place type of thing, that, you can't hold a sign, it's like usually like about a half a block or something like that. I think it may be the same thing with the Massachusetts zone. It's like 35 feet or 50 feet or whatever. No one looks at that and says, oh my God, this is such an infringement on speech that we can't have signs within this zone around a polling place. So theoretically, you would think, logically speaking, they should be able to do the same thing around a health clinic. But again, we're talking about a really crazy ass Supreme Court here, so who really knows?
Right. Well, and especially considering 75% of the women's clinics have been closed down in this country since the early 90s. I mean, there's already a concentrated area for them to picket at. I mean, there are so few clinics that it's easier for anti-choice groups to assemble and to focus their attention on specific individual clinics simply because there are fewer of them. So their job of picketing has gotten so much easier. Eliminating buffer and bubble zones simply makes the sort of harassment that created people like Kermit Gosnell to be easier. I mean, if you read the stories surrounding his case and his prosecution, the women who ended up at his clinic will tell you that the reason that they went there is because the last couple of clinics left in Philadelphia that were performing abortions were so heavily picketed, they were too terrified to approach the building. So they just went to the place where there were no picketers.
Mm-hmm. And even going back to the case here, the McCullen versus Coakley, it's the Massachusetts buffer zone case. I remember reading that Planned Parenthood actually said that leading into this case, some of the protesters outside of these clinics were actually wearing Boston Police Department uniforms and like hats and shirts, like maybe not full uniforms, but they were wearing like, BPD, paraphernalia, and so they actually were some of these protesters were being pretty deceptive, acting like, no, this is actually police officers who are trying to stop a woman from getting into these clinics.
Right, and it makes you wonder if they're so confident in their message, if they're so magnanimous in their purpose and their motivation, why does they feel the need to be deceitful? I mean, there are a number of clinics across the country that have clinic defense escorts, volunteers that help people get into clinics, and they wear vests so that they're identifiable. The new anti-choice tactic is to bus people in vests, so that it's hard for patients to determine who it is outside of a clinic they can trust. I mean, they're not there to help women. They're not there to protect anything other than their own message. I mean, if you read Adele Stan's piece for RH Reality Check the end of last year, she did this great piece where she went through and helped tie the money that comes from places like, you'll be shocked, the Koch brothers and their funding, Americans United for Life. And these are not just individual citizens sort of hanging out, doing their, I don't know, exercising their conscience. For the most part, it's very orchestrated. It has a Tea Party feel. It was supposed to be grassroots, and then we found out they were tied to all this big money. I mean, there's just not a distinction anymore between, the so-called social conservatives and the so-called economic conservatives. It's all coming from the same place.